Good morning, amici e amiche dell'Istituto Italiano di Cultura, benvenuti to this new webinar of this series that we dedicate to the dissemination of scientific culture and to stress the importance of multilateral cooperation in the field of science and research. For such series, we are delighted as usual to cooperate with the Chicago chapter of iRicerca, an international association of Italian researchers committed to create a network among young scientists and to disseminate scientific culture among the general public. I'm therefore very happy to welcome and introduce Eleonora Forte, the president of the Chicago chapter of iRicerca, who will introduce and moderate today's webinar. And a warm welcome goes to our today's speaker, Dr. Luca Lonini, senior research scientist and data scientist in the Office of Translational Research at the Shirley AbilityLab and a research assistant professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Northwestern University. As usual, the webinar is recorded and is going on, is live on our Facebook page. And I invite every one of you to type your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And then the questions will be answered at the end of Luca's talk. So Eleonora, Luca, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this Saturday for another webinar organized by iRicerca, Chicago chapter, in collaboration with the Italian Institute of Chicago. I would like to welcome the guests of the Italian Cultural Institute and the members of iRicerca who join from Chicago, but also from other chapters in the world. I would like to thank the director of the Institute for supporting our association outreaching activities. iRicerca, for who doesn't know it, aims to boost the interaction between Italian researchers from different disciplines and to promote the science outreach to the general public. For more information about the association and activities, I invite you to look at our website, aricerca.org. Without further ado, let's go started with today's presentation. It is really my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Luca Lonini, who joined the board of our chapter last year. Dr. Luca Lonini, as the director was saying, he is a senior research scientist and data scientist in the Office of Translational Research at the Shirley AbilityLab. And he also has a faculty position at Northwestern University as a research assistant professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. He has a master in biomedical and computer engineering from the University Campus Biomedico in Rome, Italy, and a PhD in computer science from Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. He has been a postdoctoral researcher in the Max Nader Lab, that is a former Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago and Shirley AbilityLab. And then he was working at Apple, working on application of wearable technology and machine learning to monitor the progression of disease affecting mobility, including Parkinson. Luca's main area of research is interdisciplinary and is in translational medicine, rehabilitation, and movement science, based on sensor and video analytics. Today, he will present the outcomes of his recent work on automated video analysis of motor impairment. I would like to recall that there will be a Q&A at the end of the talk. If you would like to address a question to our speaker, please use the Q&A feature or at the end. And Luca, you can take the floor, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Eleonora. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to iRicerca and also to the Italian Cultural Institute for hosting this talk. I'm very excited to present our recent research here, and thank you all for joining this talk this morning. So before jumping right into the topic, I just like to give a short introduction of the context where I'm working. So I'm based at the, as Eleonora mentioned, I'm based at the Shirley AbilityLab, which is formerly the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, which is a nationally ranked rehabilitation research hospital. The hospital is designed for patient care, but also for education and research, and is affiliated with Northwestern University. So as Eleonora was saying, my research is geared toward translational research in rehabilitation medicine. And so the research of our lab is truly interdisciplinary in this sense, because it intersects clinical research, data science and machine learning, and wearable and contactless sensing. So we've been working on a variety of applications, such as detecting falls from smartphones, or detecting Parkinson symptoms using smartwatches and soft wearable sensors. So those are just like some applications we've been working on. So one of the drivers of this research is really the convergence of three main technologies that are essentially surrounding our life today. So one is computing power and sensing devices like smartphones, smartwatches, etc. The other is big data and big data sets. So we are essentially seeing a growing amount of data every day available. And finally, it's the development of new algorithms. So by many people, prominent people in machine learning, effectively artificial intelligence is seen as the fourth industrial revolution. And I think I couldn't agree more with that, given the amount of applications we have. So basically, one of the enabling technologies of artificial intelligence in the past 5-10 years has been deep learning. Deep learning is a subtype of AI, which is also known as neural networks. Now, what is really astonishing is that in just 5 years, the growing amount of data has enabled deep learning to learn almost at the level of human raters. So essentially, by training these models on millions of images or millions of words and text, we've seen the error rate of the system to get down to the same of humans. So recognizing images or recognizing text at the same accuracy as us. And so the interesting thing is that these results have not been confined to academic benchmark or academic literature, but they are being translated into commercial products and consumer products. Right? For example, on the left, it's an example from NVIDIA, where using their software toolkits, they've trained a deep learning network to detect if people is wearing a mask or not in a hospital. On the right, we can see another application for essentially people with visual impairments, where the mobile phone can point to an object in the scene, and it's able to show or actually voice to the person what is that object. So one application which is particularly interesting for rehabilitation science and movement science is pose estimation. So pose estimation in general means detecting the position and orientation of an object in a scene. In the case of movement science, we are talking about people primarily. And so that means like detecting what is the orientation and position of the different joints of a person in that scene. And this field has a lot of applications even beyond like physical medicine and rehabilitation, right? We have applications in virtual reality for tracking objects. We have applications in robotics for tracking gesture recognition to control robotic systems, or even animation like animating movie characters. And in fact, like pose estimation, so the analysis of movement using computer vision, is not really a new field per se. So traditionally has been done using so-called motion capture systems. So motion capture systems means like having essentially a lab with many cameras, and then markers, reflective markers put on the person. And so as the person moves within this stage, the cameras and the computer capture this data and then can use this data to animate a character by reconstructing the movement of the person in 3 dimensions. So what's particularly exciting and new here is the fact that this technology, which again was traditionally confined to a very sophisticated and expensive lab equipment, is becoming democratized by using deep learning. So for example, this is like an open source software called OpenPose that each of us can download and run on existing videos or images to track the people movements in these videos. And so what's particularly impressive, right, is that, again, without needing like excessive, software or computing power, you can run this software and track multiple people in scenes, and track even like facial expressions and hand gestures and movements with, like kind of high accuracy, like I said, like detecting a lot of points on the person. So, I mean, why this has not been done before, and what's really challenging about this? Well, it's the fact that essentially understanding the configuration of a person from a single 2-dimensional image, it's really complex. And those are some examples of why it's complex, right? For example, you may have self-occlusions from other body parts if you have some complex poses. You may wear different clothes, or having some views which are challenging, where the left and right side of the body may be confusing. You may have occlusion from the environment or from other people that is around the subject of interest, like I said, viewing angles and so on. So, essentially, it's really hard for a computer to understand what's the configuration of the body parts and where each body part is relative to any other from a single 2-dimensional image. And that's where essentially the power of deep learning has been helping, by leveraging huge data sets of people in many different activities. And so the way these models are trained, I mean, of course, I don't have the time to go into the details of how the model works, but really the basic ingredient is data. And more importantly, currently it's annotated data. So annotated means that for training these models, you need not only to provide images, but you also need to tell to the model what is in that image. And so this means that these models have been trained on these very large data sets of like hundreds of thousands of images, where each image has been annotated, for example, by manually by people, to indicate where is the head, where is the shoulder, where is the hand, what's the bounding box of an animal. So to recognize, okay, that there is a rabbit in this image, but also where is the rabbit, for example, and also what are the activities, right? For example, playing football, playing golf, etc. So like all this data, rich data with annotations, is key to train these models. So now, after this kind of very general introduction to the applications of AI and to computer vision, I'd like to deep dive into the 3 applications that I've been working on with our lab. So starting from assessing Parkinson's symptoms using this technology. So to give you an idea, essentially, so Parkinson is the second most common neurodegenerative disorder. It's diagnosed by a specialist, usually a neurologist, based on the observation of clinical symptoms, such as tremor, bradykinesia, or slowness of movement, or dyskinesia, which are involuntary movements, as well as rigidity and postural imbalance. So essentially, the clinician asks the patient to perform a series of motor tasks that elicit the symptoms and rate each of these symptoms with a score between 0 and 4 based on their severity. Now, the other aspect of Parkinson, which essentially complicates things, is the fact that individuals with Parkinson also have to do repeated visits or assessments with their clinicians in order to manage medication and reduce the side effects. So to give you an example, those are some of the clinical assessments that are done into a Parkinson's clinic, right? So participants are asked to perform different type of movements. Those are the type of tasks or movements that I was telling you before, which clinicians use to evaluate the severity of symptoms. So it's a quite time-consuming procedure because, like a person has to schedule a visit and then they have to be there for at least 30 minutes for a single assessment. And oftentimes these visits are longer because patients also have to wait, take the medication, then wait for the effect of the medication, then do a second assessment to see how the medication is reducing their symptoms. So it's a quite time-consuming process and expensive, of course. So, like I said, the current approach to monitor symptoms essentially require the following pieces. First, a patient has to see a specialist in person. Then the specialist see the patient at a moment in time. So symptoms can change daily, and therefore, like, still the patient doesn't have like an overview of how the symptoms are changing in time. And finally, the rates or the scores that clinicians assign to rate the symptoms are subjective. And so different specialists may also disagree on ratings. The other way to track symptoms that Parkinson patients have is to keep a diary. So we all know that keeping a diary, first of all, it's hard because like you need to keep it on every day. And so it's hard to do it. In addition to that, it's also subjective. And it's easy to forget details about the specific symptoms, what time of the day you had it, and so on and so forth. So like there's still like a quite limited way to track symptoms over time. So we are working on new technology based on AI and deep learning and telemedicine to help patients track their symptoms. Essentially, the idea is kind of the following. The patient records a video, then the video is analyzed by a deep learning model to capture the movements. Then, based on the analyzed movements, a series of metrics or scores, which mimic the score clinicians, are output by the models. And then the clinician can review these scores and get in touch with the patient and discuss the optimal course of the therapy. So this is an example of how this may work. So this is one video where, again, a person like is doing the task, the patient is doing the task asked by the clinician, and the model is tracking the motion of the arm. So as you can see, essentially, those are like two different time points. On the left, it's before the patient has taken their medication. It's also said when the patient is off in jargon. On the right, it's after the patient has taken the medication, which is also referred as in the on state. So on meaning the symptoms are reduced. And as you can see, the model is able to track the change in speed or frequency of the arm movements if you look at the plots below. So here's another example where this person is performing a different task, this time with their hand. Again, at two different time points, before and after taking the medication. And as before, we can see that the model is able to track their hand motions with relatively high accuracy, in the sense that we are able to see from the plots that there is an increased speed in the hand movements between these two different time points. So now the complete model and project is of course complex, but just to give you an overview of how this works, essentially it all starts from a video or a video data set. Then we run a deep learning model to extract the poses or the body parts that we want to track. Then comes the motion extraction part, where essentially we track the motions of the body parts of interest, such as the arm or the hand. Then we compute a set of features or like characteristic of the movements which are of interest. And then we train a model on these movement patterns and features to mimic essentially the clinical scores. And then the model outputs a score which is validated against the clinical ratings, therefore trying to mimic what a clinician would do if the patient were to be seen by them. In addition to mimicking clinician scores, these models also offer us an insight into how the symptoms manifest in these patients. So in other words, they give us additional information on the phenotype of the disease. For example, in this video, this person has intermittent tremors. So the tremors are not happening all the time, but they're changing in frequency and also amplitude. So we can actually track the fact that the tremor is not constant, and we can measure the difference in like frequency or amplitude of the tremor across time. So there is like another aspect where these models may help clinicians to not only gauge if a patient is having or not symptoms, but also like what's the manifestation of this symptom, knowing that this manifestation can vary a lot between patients. And so aiming us for a more personalized therapy. So that was like one example applications of deep learning and computer vision to movement disorders. Now I would like to move to a second application that we are also exploring in our lab, which is, can we use this technology for doing gait analysis in individuals with stroke? So 70% of stroke survivors experience some form of gait deficit, going from reduced walking speed to asymmetrical walking and increased risk of fall. So gait therapy, assisted devices, and different type of interventions are key to help people regain their functional abilities. However, essentially to improve the outcomes of these interventions, it's key to perform a gait analysis. So meaning that you would like to gather quantitative data on the motion patterns, the movement patterns of the legs, in order to tailor the therapy better. And as I was hinting before, so traditional movement, or in this case, gait analysis, it's quite complex and expensive. So in this figure, you can see that how a typical gait motion lab would look like in a hospital. So you have multiple cameras, again, high-speed cameras all over the lab. Then you have sensorized walkways or plates that can measure foot contacts and the force that the feet exerts on the ground. And finally, the person typically will have to wear markers on the body parts that we want to track. Finally, all this data is translated into a 3D trajectory of different body parts after an engineer and trained clinicians essentially revise and the data and like run models to extract this data. So it's kind of a quite time-consuming process and also expensive because the equipment here is quite expensive. So instead, what we are exploring is using single videos from a smartphone to track the gait patterns in patients. And so this is like one example, right, where we are recording a patient from the waist below to preserve their privacy, and then using this data, passing this data through a pose estimation model like you saw before to track the movements of the leg, and essentially trying to estimate the gait parameters which are relevant, like what's the walking speed, what's the amount of time it takes for one leg to swing versus the other leg to swing, so measuring asymmetries. Now, what is really complicated here is the fact that if we just run an off-the-shelf model like the one I showed before, this may actually fail to track the point of interest, in this case, the foot trajectory. For example, in the plot you can see in this image, right, we don't really see a nice oscillatory plot as we've seen before, which means we're not really tracking the foot motion here. We are tracking a lot of noise. And this is due to, again, some of the reasons I was mentioning before. The person is wearing a brace on the leg, so it's kind of different from the typical data sets that these models are trained. There is another person in the image, so we need to disentangle the therapist from the patient. The view is truncated, so we are recording from the waist below. So essentially, all this data is, our data is different from the data that these models have been trained on, and therefore this causes these models to fail. So to circumvent this problem, we've been exploring approaches which go under the name of transfer learning. The basic idea is essentially the following. We, rather than training a model from scratch, we start from a pre-trained model. And now, instead of using this pre-trained model as we did before, we fine-tune, or we try to improve the prediction of these models by using our own data. So we take a small subset of images from our dataset of stroke patients, then we manually annotate the points that we want to track. So in this case, the foot, the ankle, and the knee. And then we train the network on these additional annotated images, such that the network can do a better job at recognizing these key points. And so this is like the example result. As you can see, we are able to more accurately track the leg key points of this patient. And then in the plot on the right, you can actually see that the nice cyclical periodic pattern that describes the foot trajectory in time. And then from there, we can detect events like, okay, when the heel is touching the ground, so it's called heel strike, or when the toe is leaving the ground, which is called toe off. So essentially, we can reconstruct these events that are characteristic of the gait cycle to estimate how the walking looks like. So finally, we are also interested in understanding how accurate are we relative to a clinical gold standard system. And interestingly, we are quite accurate. So in this plot, each dot is like one single measure of the gait parameters. In this case, the time it takes for one leg to swing or staying on the ground, which is stance. And so essentially, whenever the points are on the diagonal line, it means we are perfectly in agreement with the clinical gold standard system, which is a sensorized walkway, which can also detect these events, of course. So again, what's interesting is that by just using a simple smartphone camera and by fine-tuning a relatively simple deep learning model on a small subset of manually annotated data, in this case, it was just 2 frames per video. So we labeled at most 100 frames. We are able essentially to be almost as accurate as a clinical gold standard lab with minimum kind of effort. The third application I wanted to talk about is monitoring infant motor development. As before, so this is like another area where computer vision and artificial intelligence may help. So the problem is basically infants display so-called general movements from before their birth, actually through about 20 weeks of age. So the identification and presence of these so-called general movements is usually indicative of neurological disorders or delayed or atypical motor development. So essentially, like postures also and these movements can be indicative of whether the infant may have suffered essentially a stroke or a neurological problem that may lead to later problems in life in terms of motor and cognitive development. So what is the gap? The gap is that these type of assessments again require highly specialized training. So you need the clinician who has been trained to detect these patterns in the motion and then advise on whether the infant may be at risk and so may need further screening and rehabilitation or treatment. So the other issue is that, of course, like because of this type of diagnosis may be administered late or not at all, especially if we think about under constrained or under resourced environments. And finally, it's also possible that a clinician or a trained person may not detect some of the mild symptoms. So all these together calls for a need for more accessible and more robust kind of early detection tools for understanding whether an infant may be at risk or not of motor development. What we're doing here is kind of, again, in the same same approaches that I was showing before. We are pairing video data from a number of infants in addition to their clinical outcomes that are coming from trained specialists who are providing scores and diagnosis for these infants. in an attempt to train deep learning models to, again, provide an assessment of risks of an infant to be developing or not delayed motor development. And so again, simplified example of how we are doing this. So as before, if we take an off-the-shelf algorithm and run it on infant videos, we cannot expect it to work well tracking the infant, because these algorithms, again, have been trained on different type of data, in specifically mostly adults. And so because of that, we need to resort again to an approach where we annotate some of these images from the videos and tell the model exactly what we want to track in this video. And as before, we use this idea of transfer learning, which essentially means let's take a pre-trained model. Let's use the fact that this model has already learned to detect the general features in an image. And let's fine-tune this model on our smaller data set to detect where the body parts of this specific infant are in the video. And so, as before, we are labeling a small number of frames, in this case, 10 frames per video. And on the right, you can see the result of the trained model. Right? We are able to track up to 20 joints or body parts of a moving infant. So then, again, without going too much into technical details, the idea is like, once we are tracking these body parts, we can compute a set of motion features from the trajectory of each limb, which essentially will tell us something about their movement. So, example motion features are, how quickly are the wrists or the feet or the ankles moving? What's their acceleration? How correlated are the movements of the right side with the movements of the left side, and things like that. So essentially, we can kind of measure all these qualitative aspects based on the motion patterns, based on the trajectories that we are tracking in the videos, and so provide a quantitative measure of these motions. And so moving forward, the idea is like, so again, to give you an example of how we may use this data. So we extract the trajectory, in this case, for example, of the left wrist. Then we compute these motion features like the amplitude of the movements, their speed, their symmetry with other body parts, etc. So we come up with a list of numbers, or motion features in this case. And now, since we have a lot of features or numbers, we want to boil down into a single image, right? To understand how do they differ between different infants. And so in this case, I'm using a technique called principal component analysis, which basically is compressing or reducing this high dimensional space, like this large series of numbers describing, amplitude of movements of left wrist, amplitude of movement of right wrist, speed of movement for ankle, acceleration, and so on and so forth. So we are essentially compressing or reprojecting all these large number of measurements into a two-dimensional representation, which is what you can see at the bottom here. So in this plot, you see that each dot is like one measurement for one infant, and the colors are the age. So we can see that essentially colors or infants of different age are clustered in different points of these plots. And this essentially tells us that we are able to differentiate from these measures the age of the infant, which is a good thing, because essentially it's telling us, okay, we are able to track motions and we are able to extract meaningful information from these motions, which in this case is what we expect, that infants at different age will move differently, and we can see that. So obviously the ultimate goal is a little more complex than that. So we are currently exploring how we can, again, classify this large number of metrics or measurements or features from each infant into an indication of whether that infant is at risk or not of developing some neurological disorder like cerebral palsy, for example. So again, I won't go into details here also because the models are still under development, but just to give you the idea, the goal is kind of similar to what I've shown you for the Parkinson application. Like, let's train a model on these motion features, and let's use the clinical ratings to teach the model to recognize when an infant is at risk or not, with the goal finally to deploy these models in under constrained or under resourced environments where people may not have access to trained clinicians who again are not easy to access and are not a luxury for all countries. So in conclusion, just to summarize, I know that there was a lot here, so I'll try to summarize what I talked about. So first, I showed like 3 applications of machine learning and computer vision to movement analysis for clinical applications. So we've seen the Parkinson application, we've seen the stroke gait analysis application, and we've seen an application in infant motor development. Again, the path is long, but and there are of course many barriers to overcome, but in general, I'm confident that machine learning and deep learning and big data will help quantifying movement impairments, and essentially will enable what's now being called precision medicine, like essentially trying to tailor an intervention more to the individual and try to make it more effective because it's tailored on you and not like on an average of like people. And then finally, the parallel development of algorithms, new sensing technologies like more advanced sensors embedded even in our smartphones, and increased computing power on these devices will further enable the deployment of these technologies into the clinic. So with that, I would like to thank, first of all, all the colleagues that made this possible. So my lab and all the personnel in the Shirley and AbilityLab at Northwestern University who have been participating to this research, and also to our sponsors. Finally, of course, I would like to thank you, Ricerca and the Italian Cultural Institute for hosting this webinar and giving me the chance to present this work, and finally to you all for attending, being with us this morning. And now I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. This is wonderful work. It is really fascinating how medicine and patient care could really benefit from these innovative technologies. So there is time for some questions, and there are a couple already in the Q&A. So Luca, for physicians, what type of training is available for them if they want to use this technology?
So what kind of training is available for clinicians, you mean?
Yeah, physician. Yeah, that.
Oh, for physician. Yeah, actually, that's a very good question. As of now, I would say it's very limited. The reason being that currently there is still, I think, a barrier between the community that has been developing these tools, which is mostly computer scientists, and the clinical realm, physicians, therapists, etc., etc. So the training really is limited to perhaps a scientist like me or like Eleonora, who essentially have to come to talk with a clinician and hope to get a project funded, and then start first of all trying to deploy this technology and then see how fine-tune and make it work, and then convince clinicians to use that. So like essentially there are like 2 steps which are, none of them is solved. Like the first is like training, like the first is like developing these models for this application, which is still something that is just starting to see the light now. And second is deploy them clinically, and so train clinicians and make them use them daily, which is another huge barrier. Because yeah, like you need to train them, but also need to convince a specialist that this model will do as good as they can do. So which is like another barrier, I would say.
Thank you, Luca. So I was curious about accuracy, but also other people in the chat actually asked about accuracy. So Cristiano is asking about accuracy of the gait estimation methods based on deep learning compared to the standard and the expensive methods. So you presented a comparison with standard methods in terms of general gait parameters, but how accurate are the deep learning methods in terms of measurements at single joints? Also, is accuracy affected by movement speed? Gait speed in stroke patient is typically low. Can these methods be used with high accuracy for fast movement in sports science, for example?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So first of all, like we are actually reconstructing the gait parameters, but to do that, we need to track the trajectory of every single joint in the leg, or at least some specific joints of interest. And that's kind of needed, and that's relatively accurate, but it depends a lot on like I said, on the data that you've been training your model. Regarding the speed, so like essentially whether you have like fast versus low movements. I would say for fast movements, that is a problem, but the problem is not dependent on deep learning, but on the data acquisition part. So like if you have a camera with a low frame rate, like for example, a phone camera might record videos at 30 frames per second. If you have a high speed sport scene, your frames, your video will be blurred, for example. And so this like blurring will drastically reduce the accuracy of these methods. A similar issue we had with the Parkinson patient, like if they move their hands very quickly, and again, if the camera is not a high-speed camera, then you may see degrading performance. So you need to resort to kind of different workarounds, but you cannot expect the post-estimation model to work well under these conditions. For slow movements, I think it's less of a problem in general, because like I said, I think the main problem here is that fast motion will produce motion blur, which is an issue for the network to then detect where that joint is in the image if the frame is blurred. So yeah, it's kind of not solved, but I think we're getting close, as long as A, we get better cameras, B, we get more data specifically in the clinical scenarios that we want to apply these methods. So I think we can get there, but we're still not there.
Luca, we have other questions. So Rita is asking, sorry, we have so many questions that, so.
Oh, great, glad that it was interesting.
So, do you think that this technology can predict which patient may develop the disease before the onset of symptoms?
Yeah, again, thank you. It's another great question. So the short answer is it depends. And it depends on a number of factors. So first of all, it depends on, well, of course, what disease we want to try to predict. Second is the fact that to do that, we need data. So if we rely on the machine learning approach, where we need label data, so we need to acquire sufficient, in this case, for example, videos, right? That, and also paired with clinical ratings or clinical outcomes, such that the model has enough data to learn to associate video, features, outcome. So these data sets still don't exist or are very rare yet. So I think that's kind of one first barrier to overcome to answer this question. Like once we have all this data, it may be possible, right? But we are not yet there, because the data sets are still limited. So we need to get there. And the other question is also like, again, diseases are complex and are multifactorial, and there are so many other factors beyond just, in this case, the movement that we are tracking. There is also the context, like what time of the day, and so many socioeconomic factors. So like so many other factors that, again, we will need to take into account, I think, over time to deploy these models, right, and get like a complete picture of the outcome for that patient. So again, I think we are still like, you know, it is still the tip of the iceberg. Like there is still a lot to be done. But I believe again that like with the growing number of data that is being collected in different hospitals and different like parts of the world, I'm hoping that this will, you know, enable these models to work better and better.
Thank you, Luca. So another question is actually about other disease. So Marco is asking, has there been any application of these models to recognize ASD, autism spectrum disorders?
Yes. So there is some work which is essentially using the same type of approach. So like shooting videos of children, I think between 1 and 3 years old, and tracking their motions or their activities. And then with a very similar approach, like where essentially you kind of train a network to detect whether specific like motions of the infants, or in this case of the children, are more or less different for, again, children who have been diagnosed with autism from children that have not been diagnosed. So it's kind of a similar work that has been that I've been showing here, and which again I think it's still confined to the research realm. So it's not been you know, employed in the clinic as most of this work. But yeah, there is research going on that.
So Luca, Andre is wondering about, so this technology can improve early detection of mild symptoms and help the clinicians to tailor personalized treatment. So he has two questions. The first one, have you quantified the improvements? So rate of in-person assessment success versus failures versus automation. And the second one, will this be usable for full remote assessment, like with cell phone, or just as pre-screening to be confirmed by in-person assessment?
Yeah, again, great question. So to answer the first, yeah, so I started to look, I didn't show it here, but essentially I looked at the correlation of like the model predictions and the clinical ratings. And so the correlations are quite high for the Parkinson symptom like detection. So like in other words, the model is able to classify whether a patient has symptoms or not, and also the severity of the symptoms. I don't want to give a number right now because I'm still developing this, but like essentially the correlations are high, and you know there is hope that these models can actually detect symptoms. Now the problem is, and so that they also agree relatively well with clinical ratings. I mean, another problem is also that like I was saying, different specialists may provide different ratings because the ratings are subjective. So for the same patient, two clinicians may disagree. They may give a score of 1 or a 2, for example. And so like, that's also another complication here. That like then you need to really assemble multiple clinicians or multiple raters, and then train a model of, for example, on the mean or the median of their ratings. So again, if the model is trained on the clinical subjective scores, then you want to reduce the bias, right, of the single clinician. So you want to include many clinician scores. And so again, that kind of complicates more, you know, answering the question of, oh, how accurate are we at detecting the severity of the symptoms? Well, we are as accurate as that single clinician, but that clinician also may not be too accurate. So like there is this other issue here that can be solved potentially with like using multiple clinician ratings. And yeah, and sorry, I think I forgot the second part of the question or not. I was so yeah, I think that was like kind of the main thing.
So there are other questions. I think that we'll get another couple and then we'll wrap up. So Alberto is asking, have you also tried DeepLab Cut as another tool to do markerless motion tracking? It seems a quite robust tool. Maybe you did some comparison with yours. seems more specific.
Oh, that's actually amazing. So I love this question, because actually DeepLab Cat is exactly the tool I've been using when I talked about transfer learning, when I talked about fine-tuning the model for the gait analysis and for the infant monitoring. I use DeepLab Cat. I mean, for those of you who essentially don't know about that, it's like a model where you can fine-tune where you can manually label the points in a video, and then it will learn to track these points. Now, one thing I want to add here, I think it was Marco. So like, it's kind of complicated. So it is accurate, but there is a second problem that I didn't talk about here, which is generalization. So DeepLab Cat still suffer from my experiments about generalizing to new videos. So essentially, if you fine-tune a model on your data, and then you take a new video of a new patient, even if it's in a similar environment, the performance can be still very low. So I think there is still like this additional barrier when using like some of these tools like DeepLab Cat to make them more robust, to generalize to new videos in order to make them usable.
Thank you. So Fulvia is asking, could this model reveal local joint deficits specific for each patient independently from the neurological disease?
Yes, again, conditioned on the fact that we need to have good videos. In other words, like you need to have a video of sufficient resolution to track, for example, the joint movement that is correlated with this deficit. So like if you have like a smartphone camera and you're kind of moving it, and then you're very far from the child or from the person, then the model can only do as good as your data again. And again, of course, it's also the other point is also like having sufficient data to train this model. But I would say, the main challenge here is, I mean, the answer is yes, but you need to have like good data for addressing that.
Just time for the last question. How general?
Awesome.
Another question, so from Marco. How general are these models, and where could I learn more about them?
How general are these models? So the nice thing is that, for example, OpenPose and DeepLab Cat, right, are open source projects that you can read about online, right, and then you can download their code, you can use their codes, and they're, I would say, sufficiently easy to run if you have some expertise in computer science, but not necessarily super easy if you don't have. But yeah, so like you can essentially read more about these methods online and even download and try them on your data. It's totally feasible. I think the hard part comes to make this model to, like I said, to work well on your data. And that's where some additional expertise may be needed, right? So you may want to read, like how these models are trained, what kind of data do you need, or like how do you improve a model performance. So there are like, if you just want to run these models on your data, you can expect them to do as well as they are doing on their training datasets, but you may have to do some more reading on in the literature. Again, I would say in general there are lots of also courses online about deep learning, like if one wants to learn more about the principles of deep learning, which can also be very helpful to better understand how these tools work. So you can either download the tools and run them, or you can take some courses in deep learning and learn more about what's the underlying machinery, which can help understand why they fail and how to improve them.
Well, I think that's all for the Q&A. Luca, thank you again for taking time to present us today your exciting work. I would like
to
thank all of the people who are with us today for spending part of this Saturday, and the director of the Italian Cultural Institute. Also, I mean, these are presentations from Luca, but I would like also to thank the board of iRicerca chapter for the organization and coordination, in particular the chair of the outreach activities, Dr. Roberto Ponciroli. And also, please join us for our next webinar that will be next month, April 17th. We will have the pleasure to have Dr. Anna Grassellino from the Fermi Lab, who will tell us more about the SQMS, that is a National Center for Advancing Quantum Science and Technology. Thank you again, and have a good weekend. Director, do you have anything to add?
I would like just to thank Luca for this for proposing such an interesting topic that I've seen with pleasure that stimulated such a lively Q&A. And so thank you very much for bringing this to us. And of course, I'm very pleased as usual to cooperate with Eleonora and the whole board of iRicerca. And I join Eleonora's invitation to all of you for the next webinar that will be exactly on April 17. So the only thing left to say is to wish you all a nice rest of the weekend, which is sunny in Chicago. And so we'll see each other very
important
soon again. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Eleonora. Thank you, Director. Thank you all for being with us this morning. Again, appreciate it. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.